otherwise it gets too late for you as well. Have a seat. Oh, this is bad. This was really bad. So I don't need to introduce myself, but I need to introduce the things that we are doing. This is actually the third event we are doing. We had done one event on the Pontic genocide, which is also a theme that is not very well covered. Then we did an event on honoring the righteous Gentiles. That was a few months ago with the Jewish community, the Chabad. They couldn't make it today because they were on some kind of excursion. And today we have the first in the lecture series that we're organizing. We have 5 lectures coming up until April. The next lecture will be 1st of December and is on Hitler's legacy, anti-Semitism in the Middle East. Yeah, that's really an amazing topic. I read the book of the author, of the speaker. It's an amazing topic, and I got to know a lot of things I didn't know. Yeah? And now Dr. Feller, whom some of you will know from spring semester, will talk a little bit about what ISGAP is. Okay? You may have seen on the poster, ISGAP, etc. Okay?
So I'll tell you a little more about ISGAP, and I'll introduce our speaker today. First of all, thank you all for coming. As Chris said, ISGAP and the Department of History, Philosophy, and the Ancient World are cooperating to produce this seminar. Dr. Small arrived yesterday and is going to be our speaker today. I'll tell you a little bit about him, and then I'll give the floor to him because it's really a rare treat for us to have him here today. Dr. Small is a visiting professor at the Moshe Dayan Center at the University of Tel Aviv, and also the founder and director of ISGAP, which stands for the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I can't really summarize his career because it's so long and interesting, but I'll just give you a couple highlights and then we'll move on. He's been working for important causes for many years. He was very much involved in the anti-apartheid movement, also the movement to help Soviet Jewry, and is now, I'd say, a pioneer in the field of contemporary, especially contemporary critical studies of contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. It's thanks to him and ISGAP that slowly this field is emerging within the university. Believe it or not, there are lots of courses on racism and things like that within the university, but almost very few on contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. So Charles has a doctorate from Oxford, and of course is very well published and has spoken and testified to various institutions and governments around the world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Small. Thank you.
So welcome and good evening. So thank you, Chris and Glenn, very much for the introduction. It's really an honor to be here with you, so thank you. And as Glenn was saying, both these scholars have been involved with ISGAP. They were at the Oxford Summer Program. We run a program in Oxford training professors on how to create courses on contemporary anti-Semitism, because believe it or not, given the legacy of anti-Semitism, especially in Western civilization, there are not courses on contemporary anti-Semitism. It's even, I would argue, for political reasons, it's been a taboo. So scholars at the highest levels, we run programs at McGill in Montreal, at Harvard, Columbia, at the CNRS in the Sorbonne, where Glenn was running a seminar series with us. We operate programs in Kiev. We have a research center at La Sapienza in Rome. And we're really trying to make this study of anti-Semitism a part of your curriculum, a part of university curriculum. So many people, I'll get to that in a minute. I'll start off with a story. It was 1947, and if you don't understand me for some reason for language, or I speak about something that you don't get, please feel free to interrupt me, and we can ask a question, and then after we'll have a Q&A. It was 1947 in Tel Aviv, and the leaders of the Zionist movement was having a big state dinner with the British lieutenant governor, the person in charge of His Majesty's troops in colonial Palestine. And all the leaders were coming together for a very fancy dinner, and it was, with white gloves and top hat and tuxedos and gowns and all of that stuff. And in Tel Aviv, they didn't have air conditioning in the 1940s, so it was a very hot and humid evening. And the leaders of the Zionist movement and the British government were at the head table, and David Ben-Gurion, who later became the first Prime Minister of Israel, he was a very informal person. He didn't like to be so fancy. He was a very informal, down-to-earth person. So in the middle of dinner, he was wearing a top hat and gloves and a tie, a bow tie, and it was very warm and he was sweating, so he took off his hat and he put it on the floor, he took off the gloves, he took off his jacket and put it on the back of his chair, and he undid his bow tie and undid the button of his shirt and got comfortable. And the lieutenant governor who represented the King of England in Palestine became incensed because this was a formal British dinner. And so he wrote a note, he was red in the face, and he wrote a note to his assistant, gave it to the assistant brought it to David Ben-Gurion, and he said, "This is a formal British dinner, and put on your suit and tie and your formal attire immediately, or I'll cable Downing Street, and this will become an international diplomatic row." So Ben-Gurion very calmly wrote back to the lieutenant governor, and he wrote, "Don't worry, Winston Churchill said it was fine." And he wrote back, and the assistant gave it to the governor. The governor became incensed. He was shaking and red in the face. Anyways, at the end of the dinner, he ran over to Ben-Gurion and he said, "I'm going back to the embassy now, and I'm cabling 10 Downing Street, and this will be an international embarrassment. This is going to be a diplomatic conflict." And he was very upset. And then the governor said, "What do you mean Churchill said it was okay?" So David Ben-Gurion told the governor, he said, "Yeah, 2 weeks ago they were in London at 10 Downing Street having a cabinet meeting. So the leaders of the Zionist movement were meeting the leaders of the British government to negotiate the transfer of power to Israel, to the Zionist movement. And it was a very hot day, unseasonably warm in London, and everybody was around the table at the cabinet meeting, and Ben-Gurion took off his jacket, undid his tie, and rolled up his sleeves. And Churchill turned to him, he said, I don't give a damn what you do in Palestine, but here you put your shirt and tie on." Okay. All right. So, so why anti-Semitism? Why should you care about anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism, many people believe, is a problem for Jewish people. And Jewish people, there's only 13, 14 million Jewish people in the entire world. So why should students in Athens or students anywhere in Europe and the world care about anti-Semitism? It's such a particular form of hatred for such a small group. Why should you care? And the answer is very simple, and I think in a way it's very profound. And what history teaches us is that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. Anti-Semitism always begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. Once this form of hatred is unleashed into society, other groups, marginal groups, vulnerable groups, women, gay people, religious minorities, racial minorities, members of the dominant group that don't have the same political philosophy, who are not pure, they become targeted. And we saw this. You're going to have a lecture on Hitler and Nazi Germany on December the 1st. But we saw this during the Second World War, during the Holocaust. The Nazis demonized Jews, and nobody really paid attention. It was business as usual. the Americans, the North Americans, the British, the French, they were trading and doing business with the Nazis, and they thought the Nazis were anti-communist, and their anti-Semitism, well, it wasn't that relevant. But once this strain of hatred goes into society, we know the Holocaust killed at least 6 million Jews, but we know that 80 million Europeans were killed in the war, and that Europe was decimated. It was decimated economically, politically, socially, culturally. Adorno, the famous philosopher, said that perhaps Europe died in Auschwitz. That's how deep this crisis was. And I'll submit to you, I'll be very brief, but there's 3 types of anti-Semitisms with an S. So 3 forms of anti-Semitisms. I'm going to tell you the history of anti-Semitism, which is probably 2,000 years old, and I'll tell it to you in about 2 minutes, so bear with me. It's a very complex and deep subject, but I'm going to speak about the dominant forms of anti-Semitisms with an S. And I would argue that when the dominant way of perceiving the reality, of perceiving the world, was based on a religious worldview, a Christian worldview, the Jew was seen as somebody that was not capable of redemption. They were blinded. They were blinded by evil. They were blinded and incapable of accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah. Now, why anti-Semitism is such a dangerous form of hatred is that it's inherently, and I'm choosing my words carefully as a scholar, it's inherently genocidal. Unlike other forms of discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, I would submit to you that anti-Semitism is inherently genocidal. Because people believe that not only was the Jew blinded by evil for not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah, but that world redemption, the redemption of the world, was hindered because the Jews didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. So in order to bring about world redemption, the Jew had to change. They had to be civilized, they had to be converted, they had to be exiled, and in some cases they had to be killed to bring about the saving of the world. When the lens shifted from religion, when the dominant way of perceiving reality shifted from religion to race and to nation and biologically determined notions of identity, the Jew was seen as an impure race, and it was poisoning the purity, or diluting the purity of the white Aryan nation. So the Jew had to be eliminated to redeem, to save the nation and the white Aryan race. And unlike during the Christian period of anti-Semitism, this time there was no conversion. The Jew had to be eliminated. And I think this form of racist anti-Semitism culminated in the Holocaust with the racist form of anti-Semitism. So we have a religious form of anti-Semitism and a racist form of anti-Semitism, and again, the redemption is tied up in the Jew. And I'll submit to you that the third type of anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that's happening now, is an attack on who Jews are as a people. It's an attack on who Jews are as a people. So the old form of Christian anti-Semitism and racist anti-Semitism at fine universities in the Western world, at cocktail parties in the business community, going to the Ivy League or the Oxford universities, or to the New York Times or Le Monde or the Guardian, and this sort of, elite intellectual circles, to be anti-Semitic in the old Christian sense or in the racist nationalist sense is completely, it's taboo, it's incorrect. You would be ostracized if you articulated these type of views in most places in the sort of Western elite in this moment. But attack Jewish peoplehood, attack Jews who they are as a people, this is your pass. This is how you get good jobs in the academy. This is how you get good jobs in the elite media, the media of record. And this, I'll submit to you, is the new contemporary form of anti-Semitism. So while the world, it's almost like the puppeteer. So when the world demonizes Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, and demonizes it as a racist, colonial, Nazi, apartheid state, and demonizes Israel and focuses on Israel, focuses on the settlements, focuses on Netanyahu, focuses on Likud, focuses on the apartheid Zionist entity, and the demonization of Israel goes on and on and on, to the point where people in diaspora communities, Jewish students on campuses in France, in the United Kingdom, in North America, in South America, if Israel is an apartheid racist state, if young Jewish kids on campuses in a kind of postmodern liberal setting of what the university ought to be, if they have an affinity to the apartheid racist colonial state, then the kids, the Jewish kids going to Jewish organizations or having cultural, political, familial ties to this entity, they become the problem. They become the non-liberal actors in a liberal space. So what we're finding now, for example, there was a study done by Barry Cosman at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and he studied British and American students, whereas women and African Americans in the United States, about 20 to 23% of them have experienced or witnessed a racist or sexist act on campus within the last year. Jewish students, the numbers are 82 and 83% in the United Kingdom. So it's 4 times greater in the UK and the United States for Jewish students experiencing anti-Semitism on campus compared to black students being affected directly by racism and women being affected by sexism. But this is, in a sense, is politically correct. So while the demonization is happening to Israel, Jewish students in the liberal spaces are now coming under attack. If we talk about anti-Semitism, then we're inherently defending the Zionist racist colonial entity. So the study of anti-Semitism is fraught with controversy. It's not an easy topic to examine. And we see diaspora communities, particularly in places like Belgium and France, where people are actually leaving. French Jews are leaving. 15,000 went to Israel last year. I don't know, the statistics don't exist of how many have gone to North America or to the United Kingdom, but they're significant. And within France, Jews are leaving traditional Jewish communities, physical spaces in Paris and Marseille and other places, and they're leaving because of the anti-Semitism that they experienced in the urban context. The same in Brussels. Jews leaving traditional Jewish communities because of anti-Semitism. So we have the demonization of Israel, it's reigniting anti-Semitism in the West. And while the West focuses on the Jew, on the settlements, on Likud, on Netanyahu, and the sort of politically correct demonization of Israel, what do we have over here? Just like the Nazis, just like the period of the Holocaust. Focus on the Jew or the society changes. Today in Syria, we have a genocide that's taking place in real time. 4 years, 4.5 years, we have at least 500,000 people killed in the age of the internet. In an age where we can see in real time what is taking place. 500,000 people murdered. 15 million refugees. 15 million refugees leaving Syria. Flooding into Jordan. Flooding into Turkey. And of course, in the news we have the crisis, the refugee crisis that's now shaking the foundations of Europe. The stresses that it's placing on notions of national identity, on economic integration of refugees. So this is something that we have to face. But it's somehow the focus in certain sectors of the human rights community, in certain sectors of the social democratic community, has been the focus on Israel. Now, Israel, like any other country in the world, even among democracies, has problems, it has contradictions, it has policies that I disagree with and many people disagree with. But what is happening now, in this moment, we have the rise of radical political Islam. Political Islam. Have people studied about political Islam? So when I say political Islam, I'm speaking of a very specific ideology, a reactionary social movement that basically, I would argue, emerges with the Muslim Brotherhood about 100 years ago. The Muslim Brotherhood was created as a reaction to British colonialism. People like al-Banai, Qutb were the leading philosophers of the movement. Has anybody read the philosophy of Qutb and al-Banai? A couple of people, good. It's very important. And just as a footnote, they understand Western society. They speak our languages, they know our history, they know our culture. And we in the West don't take the time to really study and understand that this is a comprehensive worldview. It's deeply based on religion, on philosophy, on a political strategy, even a military strategy. These are not stupid people. These are not crazy people. These are not crazy radical people with no rational thought. This is a very important philosophical and political movement that we in the West need to understand and pay enough respect to them to take the time to understand. Because too many of us have these sort of reactions to this reactionary movement. If we're nice to them, they're going to change. If we're tough and bomb them, they're going to change. We really need to understand who they are and what they want, especially for students in this moment, this sort of globalized moment that we live in. So we have this, so political Islam, I'm not speaking about Islam, I'm speaking about political Islam. And political Islam wants to impose a kind of narrow Islamist, they call it a caliphate or a political order upon society. And unlike democracy, which has strong roots here, they don't believe in citizenship. They don't believe that people should be equal under one law. So practicing Muslims are treated and perceived and treated by the law in one way, women in another way, minorities, especially Christians and Jews, become second-class citizens, or not citizens, second-class subjects that have to pay special taxes to survive in this society. So for all sorts of reasons, given structural adjustment and neoliberalism, we have a crisis of modernity, we have a crisis of capital, if you will, and in the Middle East today, states are becoming weak. States are even failing. And I think you can tie it, I would argue, you can tie it to structural adjustment and neoliberalism and globalization. Now what's unique is that the neoliberals wanted to shrink the state, make the state weaker, so that free markets can enter into societies and bring about democracy. The Islamists perceive the state as a vestige of American or Western imperialism and colonialism, so the state needs to be destroyed. So it's interesting that the Islamists, the political Islamists and the neoliberals both hate the state. One wants to minimize the state to bring democracy and development. The other wants to destroy the state to have a free Muslim society, free of outside influences of the West, of Christianity, of Judaism, and the like. So we have this reactionary social movement, which is diametrically opposed to democracy. It's diametrically opposed to equality, diametrically opposed to citizenship, and to democratic principles. Now, what's fascinating about this movement is, as you'll hear from Matthias Kunzel on December the 1st, is that for the West, through missionaries, through Nazis, for all sorts of reasons, exported to the Muslim Brotherhood European anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is basically a European construction. So this was sort of brought to the Middle East, to the Islamic world about 100 years ago. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Does anybody know what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is? So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is very important to anti-Semitism. In the 1880s, 70s, 80s, depending on what you read, either in Russia or in France, there was this document, this fake document, it was a forged document that reported on how there were a group of Jewish people who controlled the economy and controlled society and controlled the church and secretly controlled and conspired to control the world, that they had this special meeting, and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the minutes or the reporting on this secret conspiracy. And this conspiracy, the demonization of the Jewish people, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that sort of circulated around Russia and France and then later into Europe, lay the foundations for the Holocaust. Because, in a sense, the Holocaust didn't begin with the crematoriums and didn't begin with the concentration camps and the railroad tracks. It began with ideas, and it began with words. And these words and these ideas that are inherent in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion demonized Jews to the point that society allowed and enabled the mass extermination of 6 million Jewish people, 6 million citizens, systematically. Now, it's this forged document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that is now central, not peripheral, central to the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood and of radical political Islam. It was taken into the center ideology of radical political Islam. And if you read the Hamas Charter, or the Covenant, you can see a prime example of it. They basically, if the Hamas, the people who wrote the Hamas Charter were students here, they'd be kicked out of school for plagiarism. They literally took the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, cut and pasted it, and put it into their constitution. And they speak, the Hamas Charter, as you'll see here, the Muslim Brotherhood, speaks in the tradition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in the tradition of Nazism, and I'm choosing my words carefully. They call about the killing and the extermination of not just Israelis and the Israeli state, but of all Jewish people. So the Muslim Brotherhood that has been engaged by the United States of America under the Obama administration, and the West, and other Islamists like Iran that's been engaged, they call for the extermination of Jews just like the Nazis did. And just like the period between the 1930s and 1945, just like this period, the world turned a blind eye to the anti-Semitism of the Nazis, and the world is turning a blind eye still to the anti-Semitism of the Muslim Brotherhood, of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of the Iranian revolutionary regime, which, thanks to P5+1, received $150 billion for the nuclear agreement. That's 50 years of military aid that the American government gives to the Israeli government. 50 years in one agreement, inviting them into the family of nations. And Ayatollah Khomeini, when he came to power, thanked ideologically the Muslim Brotherhood for, even though there's a Shiite-Sunni split, paid an intellectual debt of gratitude to the Muslim Brotherhood as helping to establish the Iranian revolutionary regime, the Shiite regime. And we know now, 5 days after the agreement was signed, this is when the refugee crisis really started to pick up, because many Syrians and many refugees in Turkey and other parts of the Middle East did not want to live under an Assad-Tehran axis. They fled. So we see that the chickens, as they say, are coming home to roost. So on the one hand, we have an ideology that calls for the killing of Jews, for the killing of Israelis, but because of our anti-Semitism, I would argue, we have remained silent. But the Israelis and the Jews thus far have been able to protect themselves, so far. But we see, we call this the Arab Spring. I remember I was teaching at Yale University during the Arab Spring, and we had a gathering for Passover, the Jewish holiday that celebrates freedom. We had 50 professors sitting around the table talking about the Arab Spring and freedom. And I remember watching the uprising, the riots, the demonstrations in the square in Cairo, Tahrir Square, and everybody was chanting, and there was fireworks, and it was very dramatic, and every night everybody used to run home to watch the TV.